I am an artist, and I'm going to talk a bit today about storytelling and about empathy. And I'd just like to say thank you to Bruno and to the RCN for inviting me here today, and it's a great privilege to be sharing this space with you guys. I guess there's about 100 of us in this room here right now in Birmingham, and all of us have got a story to tell. But actually, all of us have many identities. I'm here because I'm a speaker and I know something about empathy. But just half an hour ago, I'm outside texting my son, making sure that he's got up on his own because I had to leave before he was awake this morning, and did he manage to get to school, and did he forget his lunch and his books? And so I also have an identity as a mother, but I also have an identity as a friend, or as a partner, or as a daughter. And so we're all in this room made up of lots of different identities. So there's not just 100 stories in this room, there's probably 1,001 stories in this room. And I guess just to start with, that we could say that actually we're not lacking in stories. We've got a wealth of stories right here, right now, in this room, and all of those stories will be interesting. And all of those stories, I think, deserve to be heard. Outside of this room, we're surrounded by stories from everywhere, from Hollywood, from the newspapers, from billboards we see, from Twitter, from social media. But these stories are the stories that are in the public eye. These are the stories that are given attention and consideration, and they might not be the only stories that we want to hear. And I know from my experience there are many people who feel that their stories aren't being told and they aren't being listened to. And I think there's a danger if people feel that their stories aren't part of that public conversation. It's really easy to feel disengaged if you feel like you're not being heard. And then you can feel angry and undervalued and marginalized. And I think in a healthy society, we need to hear as many diverse voices as possible, and telling their stories and learning from one another and being listened to. So I guess that's what I try and do in the work that I do. I try and set up a different kind of space for storytelling. So these Hollywood stories, the newspaper stories, the stories in books, the stories on billboards, they're usually controlled by an industry who have a particular agenda. And it's not easy for all of us to break into that. We're not all going to sit down and write a best-selling novel tomorrow. Well, maybe some of you will, but I don't think I am. So what I try to do, and what I've been doing in the last 25 years, is to create public spaces, accessible spaces, and look at new creative ways where people can come together to tell their stories, to share stories, and to listen and learn from one another. So I'm just going to run through a couple of projects that I've been involved in, and then I will come on to talking about empathy and the Empathy Museum. This is a project I ran called the Museum of, and it changed what it was a museum of every few months. But this one was called the Museum of Me. And it was a response to big national institutions like, let's say, the British Museum, telling a very authoritative version of history. And this was just saying to you, what if you had to make a museum about yourself? What story would you tell? What would you choose to put into it? What would you choose to leave out of it? And the actual visitors to the museum created the whole museum. So they would go around the exhibits, and then they would fill up this can and make a little exhibition of themselves. And on day one, those shelves were empty. And by the end of the exhibition, there's 45,000 little museums of different people who'd been to the space. Just to give you an idea of a different way of approaching storytelling. Something else I do is run something called a human library, which is a bit like a normal library, but instead of borrowing a book, you borrow a person. And they're called living books. And you borrow a person who's got something to say, some story to tell, and you borrow them for a conversation. And you set it up a bit like a library, so the signage is a bit similar to the library, and then people just talk to each other. And sometimes they're themed around a particular thing like home or food or health. And I also find that sharing conversation, sharing stories is always good with food. And for 5 years I run a project called Feast on the Bridge, where we close one of the major bridges across the Thames in London, and people grow food and they all come together and cook food and share a meal and share a conversation. So there's enough room for, I think, 6,000 people to sit down together in the centre of London in a space that used to have traffic on it and share food together and share a chat together. And sometimes we have menus of conversation, like the 3 little questions in your workbook to get you started. Just things that break the ice, that bring you right into having quite a deep conversation with someone quite quickly. These are all quite big projects, and recently I've become more interested in the intimacy of sharing a story like one-to-one, the power of that one-to-one storytelling. And actually I've become really interested in the idea of listening, because it also needs a listener. A storyteller also needs a listener, and an active listener. And I've been reading a little bit about what actually is happening on a physical level. So if you're telling me your story, and I'm really listening to you telling me your story, then whatever's happening in your brain, my brain begins to mirror that, the activity in your brain. So we're actually connecting on a physical level. And there's lots of kind of neuroscientific research around it at the moment. But I guess what I think that is another kind of empathy. It's the imaginative leap that I'm making to see the world from your perspective. And that's what I'm interested in, is empathy. And in the last couple of years, I've been running a museum called the Empathy Museum, which creates projects where people can take part both as storytellers and as active listeners. I guess there's a question about why we're doing that now. Oh, there go my notes. And I think we'd all agree that we're living in a more divided, a more conflicted world. There's a massive rise in loneliness and isolation, and a decrease in public spaces where people are coming together naturally. And there's also a massive rise in sort of social media, and a feeling that we're more globally connected to one another. But actually, we tend to surround ourselves with people who are very like ourselves. Even online, our social circles and our work circles are incredibly small, and we tend to interact with people who uphold our values and our view of the world. So empathy levels are on the decrease. Sorry, that was my active listening slide. That's one of the projects I've been running. But Barack Obama calls it an empathy deficit, and talks about how he describes empathy actually in the way that a lot of people describe it, about standing in someone else's shoes or seeing the world through somebody else's eyes. So I listened to people talking about what empathy was, and I thought, actually, what if we take this old proverb, never criticise a man till you've walked a mile in his shoes, and we make that actual, we make that real. So we open a shoe shop called A Mile in My Shoes. And in that shoe shop, which we've made to look like it's a shipping container converted into looking like a giant shoebox, which arrives in your town centre. And inside are a collection of shoes and a collection of stories that go with those shoes. So we tried to reach out within the community to as many diverse people as possible. So I think the youngest person who took part was 8, and the oldest person is 97. And they could be the shoes and stories of anybody from any walk of life. There's a sex worker, a sewer worker, there's a midwife, there's someone who is a fisherman, there's all sorts of different people in there. And what happens is you come into the shoe shop, and you get fitted with a pair of shoes that belong to a stranger in your size. And then you put on a pair of headphones and you go out for a walk. And you listen to that person's voice in your ears while you're walking in their shoes. And you're on a physical journey, but you're also hopefully on an empathetic journey. So you're walking along and you're looking down and actually you don't recognize your own feet, but you've got the shoes of someone else and you're listening to their voice talking to you. And I won't listen to that story in the same way as anybody else will listen to that story in the room, because we bring with us our own experiences of life and we connect with that person who's talking to us in different ways. But I would say I believe that there's a shared humanity and that we all feel joy, we all feel grief, we all feel love, and we connect with one another. Even if that person's a total stranger, we find empathy with them. I think there's also something that's quite playful about putting on someone else's shoes. It reminds me of when you're a kid and you try on your mum's shoes, well, like this boy here. And so you go out in a walk and you might get a pair of high heels or a pair of waders or a pair of roller skates. And I guess you make unexpected connections with total strangers. And I've collected quite a lot of these stories now, probably 200 stories. And I think the thing that makes those stories powerful, just if you're talking about telling your own story, it's quite often about the little details of someone's life. It's not about the whole picture from when they were born to right to now, this day. If you take even like 1 hour or 1 day or one detail or one event that happened, and you describe that absolutely like it happened. So you're not reflecting on it, you're talking to imagine you're talking to someone, and you're also using your senses. What did it sound like? What did you see? What did it feel like? What did you touch? What did it smell like? And it's those direct things that we can all kind of connect with. We tour this project and we go to different cities around the world. Next week we're going to Brazil with it. And everywhere we go, we collect new stories and new pairs of shoes so that there's a reflection and voices from the community that we're showing the piece of work inside the shoebox. So hopefully people can recognise their town in this collection of 200 shoes. We also do themed versions. So we're doing a version around migration, but we did a version with the Health Foundation. And we collected 30 new stories from across the UK from the worlds of the NHS and social care. So it's got patients, it's got nurses, it's got doctors, it's got a hospital porter, a prison psychologist, an imam who works in a hospital, all sorts of different people's voices. And then we showed this work at the Houses of Parliament. So the idea was that policymakers and politicians who are shaping policy actually walked in the shoes of the people who are delivering the service. And I guess what I've learnt about the storytellers is that there's something very cathartic and empowering about saying your story out loud, and that should be a very positive thing that's held in a very non-judgmental space that gives voice and gives value to those stories. And that by saying stuff out loud, one's able to make sense of one's own story and move on from that in some way. And that's the kind of feedback that we've had from storytellers that we've worked with. So I would say and encourage you, the 100 people here, to tell your 1,001 stories about what it's like to walk in your shoes, and for all of us to listen to those stories. Thank you very much. Bruno, is there a question thing, or is it?
Anybody got any questions?
Yeah. The museum travels around. So if you look on that website, it tells you where we're going to be next. So next we're in Brazil and Belgium, and then we do a project in London, and then we're going to do a tour of the north of Britain at the beginning of next year.
Is there a home address?
Yeah, it's just this empathymuseum.com, and that tells you where we are going to be next. Yeah.
When you went to have the panels, did they actually walk around in the shoes?
Yeah, some of them, I do admit, used it as a photo opportunity and didn't do much walking, but some people really did. And if you go on the Health Foundation website, you can see some of the politicians talking about their reflections. But I think also interesting, we showed it at quite a lot of health expos, and quite often it's people who were working quite closely with one another. The big kind of, there was a GP who walked in his receptionist's shoes, and even though they share this space every day, he had no idea really what her experience of being at work was like until that. And for me, that was kind of one of the more powerful moments of the whole project. Yeah.
Fantastic. I was wondering, is there any scope for more work within the NHS with local trusts and to really build our own empathy for our service users? We feel that it's potentially something that we are losing more on that downward slide. Just think that goes on at night. But is there any scope for any of this really fantastic work to be brought in via either leadership academy or potentially local authority within individual?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I think maybe that's part of a longer conversation. But we get asked to do it in all sorts of different settings with all sorts of different groups of people. And it is just a very simple idea, but it is quite a powerful way of experiencing the way that one another sees the world. Yeah. They're up until this point, they've all been in English, but there's transcripts so that if you're deaf or hard of hearing, you can read them. But we're now looking at what we do about ones in other languages, and we're trying to find a way that you could kind of access the stories on a smartphone or whatever and see the subtitles as you go. But I'm working on that at the moment. I think that's it. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.